And welcome back to the final screencast for the first week of class, week number 1, which will take us all the way through these units until we finally conclude with week 12. And then you are left to your own devices to complete the final exam. I also want to thank you for kind of braving rather treacherous waters. Sometimes people who do these online classes and record these videos make the videos too long. Sometimes they make them very short. You try to aim for the short side, but they get longer and longer. I used to do some videos for a class a few years ago that were an hour long each, and I'm breaking them down to try and make them between 5 minutes and 15 minutes, no longer than that, 5 to 15 minutes. And so hopefully I have succeeded thus far, and I'm holding your attention. This is some rather thick stuff that we're talking about right now, and it's somewhat meta. We're not talking about things in history right now. We're talking about history as a subject and the history of history in some ways. So yeah, I am kind of tripping your minds a little bit here. But like I said before, just endure this for this first week. If you notice, I don't have any quizzes. I just have a discussion board in this lecture. Take some notes. Keep all this in mind, because once we go through and we look at all these different themes, there'll be subtext here where we have to understand why people look at things in certain ways and how people look at things in certain ways and how we grapple with understanding the past and why we do things the way we do. And we'll revisit this again near the end of the semester. So let's wrap up this lecture. Now, I'm not going to go through all 5 of the 5 C's of history: change over time, context, causality, contingency, and complexity, because John Fia does it far better than I can. And if I did it, I'll simply be repeating what he says. And while I have repeated some of what he said in this, I brought my own approach to it, and I've applied it a little bit differently for the purposes of this class. But the reason why I wanted you to review that article and or his video before coming to this final wrap up is to understand this is the way we look at the past as historians and the way you should look at the past as we move forward. Time is not simply a collection of events that stay stagnant. They do change over time. When we understand the circumstances of these events, we can understand why people thought the way they did and did what they did or reacted the way they did. We also understand that for every action, there is a reaction. There is causality here. There's a reason why something occurs. The Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 is pretty much the catalyst of why the United States directly got involved in the Second World War. Now, we weren't completely uninvolved up to that point. We were involved in very indirect ways, but that attack was the catalyst that led to a declaration of war. So the causality in that case, the causality for us going to war was that we were attacked, but then there's contingency as well. Contingency is a series of events that happen that all relate to each other. So you have essentially it's causality with a much broader scope. So why did the Japanese attack us? Well, there's a number of reasons why. The Japanese were imperialists. The United States was imperialist. They were clashing in the Pacific. The Japanese wanted to take more control. They wanted to have an empire. They already had an empire, but they wanted a bigger empire. The Japanese also subscribed to their own interpretation of social Darwinism, that the Japanese race was superior to the European races. And we'll get into all this later on when we talk about the Second World War. The Japanese also used to buy oil and metal and steel and other goods from the United States. And the United States, in response to their aggression in the South Pacific and their alliance with Adolf Hitler, cut them off from their oil and their supply of raw materials. And eventually the Japanese attacked the United States, or at least attacked the outlying territory of Pearl Harbor, which was an attack on the United States, although Hawaii was not a state at the time. So contingency is that there were reasons why the United States did what it did, and there were reasons why the Japanese responded as such, which therefore made us respond another way. This would be contingency. Events are contingent upon other events. Contingency also shows us or teaches us that just because something happened the way that it did doesn't mean that there weren't alternatives. Had the United States, for example, not stopped selling oil and scrap metal to Japan, perhaps the Japanese might not have attacked Pearl Harbor. There wouldn't have been any reason to, at least not yet, not at that point. There were other things too. But let's just theorize for a moment that maybe they wouldn't have. Well, if they wouldn't have, then the United States, at least up until that point, would not have directly declared war on Japan and her allies and gotten involved in the war, at least not in the South Pacific. So contingency teaches us that there are many, many, many different events that occur that lead to other events, that lead to other events, that lead to other events, so on and so forth. But also it reminds us that historical events are not, how did John Fea put it, ordained by providence. That is, there are always options, and the way things unfold because certain things happen in a certain way at a certain time, and the responses of all these other things were contingent upon those decisions and those actions and reactions. Again, this is a little heavy, but as we go through these next few weeks, feel free to talk about these ideas of change over time, context, causality, contingency, and complexity as we discuss these matters in our discussion board. In fact, you'll find that some of my discussion questions will usually be a series of questions that you have to answer, or at least answer a few of them. And often I will have some kind of question related to one of these 5 C's of history. So just keep that in mind and make sure you take good notes on what John Fea and the article says on these. So let us conclude with this very important question. What was the purpose of this week? Now, I've alluded to this several times. I talked about wanting to give you a base of understanding what historians do. I have essentially knighted all of you as historians of this class. We are all peers among all of us. Maybe I'm a little bit higher in rank because I'm your teacher, but we are all knights of the round table. And while I might be Arthur, all of you are equal at this table of history. And we will learn from each other about these events by reading the documents, by asking questions, by discussing them in the discussion board. So I've alluded to all this. I've said this numerous times, but what exactly is the purpose of this week? I could have easily taught this class without having this somewhat convoluted lecture. So why am I doing this? Take a moment, think about it, maybe jot some things down, come back in about a minute, and we'll talk about it. So, what is the purpose of this week? Well, I have a whole bunch of them that I had already laid out, and I don't know what you wrote down, but clearly there are many, many reasons why a kind of a wider understanding of the discipline of history can be beneficial before you actually study history. But although I am a man who considers himself to be an artist, theatrical performer, I've done playwriting, stage manager, and I consider history definitely to be very much a humanity. But as I said before, it is a social science as well. And there are methods and there are structures that we need to understand that help us do what we do. We're not simply people who study our family history. We're not genealogists. And we're not people who just remember trivial information such as what kind of gun was the most popular in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, or uh, why the Model T that Ford created was so incredibly popular. All of that is important. Trivia information is not something we should ignore necessarily, but there's a lot more to it than that. There are methods, there are different ways of understanding things, of analyzing things, and ultimately, this is the purpose of this week. All of you, or most of you, I haven't looked at what your backgrounds are yet, are taking classes in various disciplines. And many of you are probably not history majors. I imagine, if I'm just going off the top of my head, probably have some education majors, uh, kinesiology majors, exercise science majors, maybe some psychologists, pre-law, pre-med. We'll probably have maybe a business student or two, possibly a student who does engineering or music, the arts. And all of those classes have something in common, and that is they are classes in which, when you learn about the subject that you're learning about, whether it's musical instruments or engineering or whatever, you don't just learn, you do. And that's an important thing we have to understand in history. History is not something that just happens to you or that you learn, it's something that you do. History is an action. It doesn't just act on you, you act on it. You analyze and you interpret. History very much relies on interpretation. Its lifeblood is interpretation. Without that interpretation, it's no longer history, it's just the past. And the past is just a large collection of random events, a whole bunch of them. Again, I like using that quote, one damn thing after the other, a whole bunch of them that really have seemingly no relationship to each other. And it's up to us to make some sense out of it. Because if we don't, then it's just going to be a complete mess. So if you were a chemist or a biologist and you're taking a biology class or a chemistry class, you're not just going to sit in biology or chemistry and study the periodic table or subshells, S shells and subshells, or how compounds are made and the differences between weak acids and strong acids in aqueous solutions, so on and so forth. You're going to do those things. You're going to have a lab. You're going to mix chemicals, mix things to create different types of products, see reactions, and you're going to perform lab work. You're also going to perform chemical equations. In biology, you might dissect something, open it up, look at the inside, measure organs. You're going to be working with Punnett squares. You're going to be, how I'm thinking about the high school, working with fruit flies, for example, trying to breed different generations of fruit flies to study recessive genes. You don't simply learn about biology. You don't learn about Pasteur, and you don't learn about Jonas Salk. I mean, those things are important. You do learn about them, but you also actually physically do biological experiments and lab work as you do in chemistry, physics, so on and so forth. If you study business, for example, you might have some practical experience that's required in your classes. For example, if you're taking a class on entrepreneurship, you might be required to form a team and create maybe either a theoretical or an actual entrepreneurial venture, a small business, maybe something that the creation of some sort of invention that helps to spread peanut butter over toast better, or maybe you're creating a new way of recording podcasts, or maybe you are coming up with a better way of making energy cheaper or more efficient, some kind of entrepreneurial thing. If you do computer sciences and you're studying computer programming, you're not going to just learn about the history of programming or how programming is done. You will actually be programming as well. And if you do math, study mathematics, or you're taking math classes, you will be, unfortunately, if you're like me, it's more of a torture, but you will be performing mathematical equations as well. So that is why I am giving you this lecture, because this whole class is designed essentially like one of those. We will have the lectures where you will learn about China, Japan, social Darwinism, industrialism, wars, economic depressions, the information that you were probably typically expecting to learn in such a class. But you will also analyze historical material, primary sources, and you will perform analyses on those. And eventually, your final exam will be a culmination of all of that work. And you will discuss these matters too with your peers, your fellow historians in this class, and I'll chime in as well. So this history class very much has what you would call perhaps a lab. There is a lab aspect to this. And the reason why there's a lab aspect is because, remember, history is not merely learned, it is something you do. And hopefully you will remember this as we move forward and keep this in the back of your mind as we analyze these sources and go through week by week. So with that, I want to thank you for making it through the first week of this class. Make sure you pay attention to when the discussion boards are due. There is only a discussion board this week. There is no quiz. And make sure your syllabus agreement has been filled out and turned in, and you'll get some bonus points for that. And remember that you are required to post at least 3 posts on the discussion board. You will have to make a primary post, which is your kind of first initial post where you respond to the prompt or questions I give. And then you have to respond to at least 2 more times to other people's primary posts. So you make a post, and then eventually you come back after other people have made posts, read some of their posts, make some responses, and you're good to go. Make sure they're quality responses and not just compliments or things like that. Make sure you're asking questions. Make sure you're making comments, things like that. Make sure it's dynamic. It's like having a classroom conversation. You may, of course, post as many times as you want, but the minimum is 3. So thank you very much. I look forward to discussing industrialism with you next week. And then the following week after that, we will discuss Darwinism and social Darwinism. So have a good one, and I will see you next week.